I was here 2 years ago at the conference, and I won't go on as long as I did 2 years ago about the Cincinnati Children's Hospital Charge Clinic. But I do want to repeat myself and just say this is something that we've dreamed about for over 30 years, initially in England for me, and I gave up on the idea probably 15 years ago because it was obvious no one was ever going to create this kind of facility, this kind of service. And then I heard that it was happening in Cincinnati. And it is just a wonderful, wonderful achievement to have created something that really is multidisciplinary, and that the client feedback or the customer feedback that I'm getting from parents is overwhelmingly positive. I mean, they really can't say enough good things about their experiences when they come to this clinic. And then, like the cream on the cake really, is organizing these conferences, I hope every 2 years, to fill that gap between the big Charge Foundation conferences. It's been a day of fantastic presentations. I don't often get the benefit of listening to medical specialists presenting on Charge. So I've been sitting and learning all day, which is a great treat for me. I don't learn very much these days, mostly because of my age. But today I've actually been learning. And I've also been observing, and I've watched you all shrinking through the day. You're all much smaller now than you were at 8:45 this morning. So what you need is something light and amusing and easy to absorb. Unfortunately, you've got me at the end of the day. And I'm, as Dan said this morning, I'm a person who always brings about 5 times more slides than are possible to get through. I've just looked and I have 103 slides in 40 minutes now. So don't worry, I'll skip a lot of the slides. And slightly off, well, everything I do is off topic, but very off topic. I just wanted to start with this slide totally from my personal experience as an itinerant deafblind specialist teacher. I've been working with children with Charge for 35 years. And these are the issues that I find myself telling parents and teachers about because they haven't realized that these existed, or they haven't come across them before, or they are asking me about issues which they didn't think were associated with this syndrome. And I just made a quick list of the kinds of things that I'm always telling people about because they're being missed. They're not part of the acronym. And people, although the acronym, as someone said today, it's a great acronym, but people are inclined to think CHARGE is C-H-A-R-G-E. And once you've memorized that, and I keep hearing people trying to remember what the H is for and what the G is for and all that kind of thing. And I think sometimes it's a bit of a distraction or a bit of an obstacle to really grasping the complexity of the syndrome. And the more time goes on and the more we learn about Charge, the more complicated it gets. And it's now so much more complex than we used to think 20 or 25 or 30 years ago. And because I'm so distractible, I start with talking about deafblindness, and then I move on to other things. So we'll see how we go. I have my alarm clock, so I'll know when to stop at 5. Don't worry, I won't go over. But I want to make the main point today, I think, is that this is a multi-sensory impairment syndrome. And I think it was it Susan who said this morning, the most multi-sensory impaired syndrome? Oh, it was Donna, sorry, yes, you were first. And it's a syndrome that we know involves vision and hearing in lots of ways for lots of reasons. But it also involves all the other sensory systems, and that's very, very important. And the word deaf-blindness is a complex one. It's not a very pleasant word to contemplate, especially for your own child. And of course, it's a compound word. It's two concepts of hearing loss and vision loss put together in one word. And because deaf-blindness often gets misunderstood, in the UK, when I was still based in the UK in the early 90s, the decision was made to replace deaf-blindness with multisensory impairment, or MSI. And MSI is the term that's stuck in the United Kingdom. So my degree is in the education of children with multisensory impairment, not deaf-blind. And when I go home, parents talk about MSI programs, MSI training courses, MSI teachers. It's become very well established. Here in the US, when I came here 18 years ago, I had to get used to saying deaf-blindness again because MSI didn't mean anything. So I tend to say deaf-blindness these days, which is a pity because I think MSI is a truer label to use for the children. And then I've got some quotes from things I've written to try and keep me on track. And this is from a piece I wrote about 8 years ago. Most people with charge that I've met satisfy the criteria for being considered as having deaf-blindness, even if they have some useful vision and hearing. This is a disability that's defined, deaf-blindness is a disability that is defined in functional, not clinical terms. And for each individual with charge, it's mostly about difficulties in accessing information, not just from the world around them, but even from their own bodies. And that's another theme of this presentation. We need to think about the way your child communicates or not with their own body before we start to think about whether or not they communicate with the world around them and with other people around them. And I think deaf-blindness, the philosophy of deaf-blind education, is a wonderful fit for anyone with charge syndrome, whether they're considered deaf-blind or not. As an educational philosophy, it's comprehensive and it covers everything you need really for working out the educational program and providing the education for a child with charge syndrome. A colleague in England, Gail Deuce, published an article about educating learners with charge syndrome in the British Journal of Special Education last year. And two quotes from her, she references me. Brown argued that a deaf-blind pedagogy is likely to provide the best fit when educating learners with charge, although he also suggests that there is the likelihood or need to consider other issues that might be more specific to this group of learners. And then at the end of the article, she says, the view that deaf-blind pedagogy might provide the best fit for learners with charge was also explored. The findings of this investigation suggest that the deaf-blind educational philosophy and approaches to teaching are likely to be an effective pathway to follow for educators of learners with charge. In addition, however, it was found that some aspects of established deaf-blind practice may need to be applied in an alternative way or for a different purpose, and that a supplementary approach is also likely to be required. And I think what I was implying and what Gail is implying is that the deaf-blind education philosophy is a good way to go and a good way to think and a good structure to use to evaluate and to teach your children. But you need to be very eclectic and very open-minded and very promiscuous, really. And if you find something in the field of autistic education or education of children with orthopedic disabilities or whatever, if it looks useful and if it looks like it might fit, go with it. Your child doesn't have to be labeled autistic or labeled orthopedically disabled or any of those labels. And I know getting the right label sometimes opens the door to specific services, but that's a whole other issue to me than thinking of an educational philosophy that works. And another quote from me, children with Charge syndrome are truly multi-sensory impaired, having difficulties not only with vision and hearing, but also with the senses that perceive balance, touch, temperature, pain, pressure, and smell, as well as problems with breathing, swallowing, eating, drinking, and you're familiar with this. And that's been a theme of most of the presentations today, indeed. And then a quote from my great guru, Jan van Dijk, who died earlier this year. He wrote this, and it's written in his one, he was Dutch, and his English was fluent but idiosyncratic, and it comes across in the quote. He called this personal conclusion after more than 30 years of scientific and practical work. And he says, the multisensory impaired person is a unique human being with a unique line of development who is more dependent on the professional's willingness to accept this and act accordingly than any other group of disabled persons. And what he's saying is, we have to go to them. We have to go where the child is. We can't sit and say, this is what I do, this is how I teach, this is what I teach, and expect the child to come to you and attend and follow and learn. And Van Dijk again and again pushes the idea that we need to go to them. We need to meet them where they are, with the things they're doing, with the things they're interested in, and with the things that they like. Another article that I wrote, I said, a good and effective educational program, while being very positive and having high expectations, should always take account of the fact that everything that a child with Charge syndrome does, everything that they do, is likely to take more thought and attention and concentration and energy and time for them than it does for us. And we have to remember that all the time, from moment to moment, when we're working with a child with Charge syndrome. It's very easy as they grow and develop and acquire skills, it's very easy to forget that they are all the time having to put more of these things into what they're doing, even though they have a way of making these things look easy and look natural. They rarely become easy and natural, in my opinion. And when I get the chance to talk to older teens and adults with Charge, like I did a month ago in Germany, it's fascinating to probe them and discover the strategies that they've evolved in order to do things that look fairly normal and fairly straightforward and fairly easy. And because of the complexity of Charge, because of the multisensory nature of the problems, and because of all the medical issues that are layered over and mixed in with the sensory impairments, there's huge variability of perception, of sensory perception. There's huge variability of function, and these children can be more deafblind or less deafblind, not just from day to day or hour to hour, but even from moment to moment. And another of the things I do again and again in my job as an itinerant teacher is try and help people explore What are the factors internally in the child that are going to affect their sensory perception abilities and their functioning? And then what are the factors outside the child in the environment around them that are going to have that profound impact on their ability to perceive sensorily and to function? We all have enormous variation of sensory perception abilities and enormous variation of function. Your functioning at the moment is pretty poor, and I know that just by looking around the room. And I know that anyway because it's almost 5 o'clock. But it's perfectly normal to have variable functioning. But of course, this is much more marked and much more extreme in a condition like charge syndrome, but we shouldn't be surprised. And we've got to keep reminding people not to fall in the trap because they see a child see something or hear something or manage an activity once to assume that they can do that anytime that you want them to do it. It doesn't work like that because people don't work like that. And we've got to, again, remind people and try and be proactive and stop them using the L word, lazy, which is, one of the most common adjectives used with students with charge syndrome when I go into schools. These children are anything but lazy in most cases, in my experience. And the other word is the S word, of course, spoiled. She's very spoiled. And we have to remember that education is not compliance training, which, I mustn't keep going on about education, but I do, because I've been working in other people's schools all my life, and now I don't because I'm retired, and I just feel I've had enough of it. But anyway, and I think in defense of the deaf-blind educational philosophy, far from being separate and different from mainstream education, good quality deaf-blind educational practice in assessment, instruction, and program evaluation offers significant lessons to all students and to all educators right across the board. If every child born got good quality deaf-blind education, they would get a better education. They really, really would. And not the least of the advantages of thinking about this philosophy is the concept of the intervener, which many of you will be very familiar with. The one-on-one aide who's allocated to a student with charge to support them through their education. I'm going to skip lots of slides here and say, what do you do? Most people focus on the child's disabilities in education, I've noticed, and in school settings. But if you pay close attention to the child's abilities and to the things that they do, it can reveal more about the difficulties they face and the strategies they use to function effectively. If I'm asked to assess a child, to go into a school and assess a child, I like a little bit of information in advance, and then I go into the classroom and I smile a lot and I say, I'll just go over. They often want to give me the child. And there's a feeling I'm sure they think if I just touch the child, they'll be cured, and I can understand that. It would be wonderful if it worked like that. But they're often confused because I don't do anything. I just sit in the corner and I make reams of notes. Everything I see, everything I hear, I'm writing down. And I have question marks and asterisks and arrows and all sorts of things on my notepad, because I'm interested in what the child's actually do, how they sit, how they use their hands, what they look at, what postures they use to look, how they get up from the chair, what do they do in recess when they're outside in the yard, how do they approach food, how do they handle a book with paper pages. All those kinds of questions are in my mind because the answers to those questions are going to get me thinking about areas of difficulty and areas of creativity and strength. And these are children who can be so creative, it's staggering, and we don't know how they manage it. But they do, child after child. And I see children with charge who are perceived as having major cognitive disabilities. And then I see these functional adaptive behaviors that nobody's taught them. They've just devised them all by themselves. And I think, how can you say this child has significant cognitive disabilities when she's worked out how to do this? It's a huge misunderstanding that we have to keep battling. And a point I've always pushed my whole career, and I found out last week from something Tim Hartshorne sent me, that we share the same, well, I knew we shared this philosophy, but I found out it's quite a legitimate philosophy coming from a well-known psychologist or a psychiatrist. A psychiatrist called Adler. Anyway, everything children with charge do has meaning, and if you're going to teach them, the first obligation on you is to try and work out what it means and then test and see. So, back to the senses. This is the pyramid of learning, and it's a graphic way of demonstrating the sequence from bottom to top in which things develop and in which things, a hierarchy in which things need to be sequenced for effective learning to take place. And at the bottom, we've got the central nervous system, or the brain. And at the very top, if you can read it, that little piece at the top of the pyramid is academic learning. And that's what politicians and bureaucrats think is the point, the only point of education. But if you look at the diagram, you can see that academic learning is a long way away from the bottom level, which is our sensory systems. And the sensory systems provide the foundation, the absolute basis for learning and developing and acquiring skills. And if you look carefully, you'll see the senses are arranged on two different levels. And you've got touch, the vestibular sense, and the proprioceptive sense on the bottom, and then the other senses on the next level up. And those three senses are particularly important in providing a good, stable foundation for those other senses to develop on, and then all those other things to develop as the child grows and goes on. And I'm going to jump onto the vestibular sense, which you've heard about from several speakers today. And as Dan Chu said, I've been going on about this for at least 25 years. I think that the vestibular issues in charge are very overlooked. I'd say misunderstood, but I don't think people are even trying to understand them. So they're overlooked. And I wrote, of all the many sensory impairments associated with the syndrome, absence of or significant damage to the vestibular sense is perhaps the most far-reaching in its implications for development, the least understood, and the most overlooked. In the future, it's likely that we will discover close links between significant vestibular impairment and many of the currently unexplained or confusing charge behavioral features, such as difficulty with self-regulation of arousal levels, sudden and apparently unpredictable mood changes, poor memory, and executive dysfunction. And excuse me if I keep jumping ahead. I don't jump ahead very well now, owing to vision problems. And I'm not going to say a lot more about the vestibular sense, but it's popularly known as the balance sense. It's actually much more than just the balance sense. But if you just think about balance and postural control, This is a quote from Jean Ayres, who was the occupational therapist who came up with the idea of sensory integration and the therapy approach of sensory integration. And she said, after air to breathe, postural security is our next most urgent priority. And if you've got all those sensory impairments that most people with charge have, including significant vestibular problems, then postural security is going to be very challenged. And what Jean Ayres helped me understand is that if your postural security is threatened, if you don't feel that your body is under control and safe and not going to fall, then your brain is going to focus on that. Whatever your teacher wants you to be doing, whatever your mom or your dad want you to be doing, your brain is going to be saying, where's my head? Where's my body? Is it safe? How can I make it safe? And it might be safe, but that child's brain has to know that it's safe. They have to get that confirmation, or we have to give that confirmation to them. And the crux of the problem really is gravity. Resisting gravity is very difficult if you don't see properly, if you don't hear properly, if you don't feel properly, if you don't feel your body very effectively, and if your vestibular sense is not telling you where your head is or how to keep your head and your body safely resisting gravity, then it's going to be difficult. And the PT from Perkins School said this in a talk at one of the foundation conferences many years ago. For children with charge syndrome, gravity sucks. And she meant that kind of literally and also metaphorically. And I was an early intervention specialist in England, birth to 5, and I've recommended a resonance board and a little room type idea to family after family after family after family. And I know most of you here have children who are older than infants, young infants. But I do think there's nothing I know, no equipment certainly, that's more effective in helping children to develop better body awareness, better postural control, and more effective movement and mobility skills than a resonance board, a simple wooden resonance board, and some kind of structure like a little room. The resonance board helps the children to think horizontally and move in terms of moving around. The little room type structure helps the children think vertically up. And if you can give the child that kind of idea, that kind of environment, the moment the child looks and sees something up there, or the moment they move their knee or their hand and touch something up there, they're on the road to standing and walking. It starts from that kind of experience and that kind of mindset, thinking about up, because their bodies are melting into the floor because that is the secure position. Unless you're stupid, you're going to push your body back into the floor because you don't want to fall over, you don't want to bump your head. It's terrifying. And you've probably, from lovely people picking you up and bouncing you around, you've probably experienced those moments of panic when you fall or you think you're falling, when you bang your head. So these kind of environments are a great way to start children thinking about resisting gravity under their own steam, under their own control. And we know about early mobility in charge. I'm sorry, this is getting more and more scattered. The 5-point crawl, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, though I saw somebody this morning doing regular crawling with his head up, and I thought, that's fairly unusual in young kids. And I wanted to rush over and say, how long has he been crawling with his head up? Because usually 1 month. Did he do 5-point at the beginning? Yeah. And most children who 5-point crawl never do regular crawling. They then end up pulling up, and they, in the end, they walk. But I think it's a really good sign if the head's up and they're doing normal crawling. So that was really nice to see. Right, what am I doing here? We got 15 minutes. Balance or equilibrium. People think the vestibular sense is the balance sense. Actually, it's one of the 3 sensory systems that contributes to developing and then maintaining good balance and good postural control. The vestibular sense, vision, and proprioception, or that internal feeling of your own body that responds to compression and stretching. And those 3 together give us a good base for resisting gravity in a controlled way. And of course, in charge syndrome, it's quite likely that all 3 of those sensory systems are not working properly for various reasons. And anything we can do to improve the functioning of any of those 3 sensory areas is going to be a contribution to better postural control, and we hope eventually to walking, standing and independent walking. And one of the questions I'm asked most often by parents is, how can we get her to walk? You know, she could walk, but she won't. And the first thing I always say, which I'm sure is not at all helpful, every child I know with charge walks at exactly the right moment. They never do it too early, they never do it too late. But it's exactly the right moment, and they're the only ones who know the exactly right moment. That's the problem. And if they could just let us decide the right moment, but that's never going to happen. And if you try that, you end up with all sorts of catastrophe. And there's a whole range of approaches to be used. This is one of my favorite Walker pictures. I just love this picture. I don't know who that is. I know he has charge. And the person who used the picture let me have it. And she said, I don't know where I got this picture from. This was a long, probably 12, 13 years ago. And the other big breakthrough for me personally, and from me to more and more families, is thanks to Donna and her son. I saw him at a foundation conference using walking poles. And I was stunned. I just never thought of them. I thought they were for people, who went hiking over the Himalayas kind of thing, which I would never do. So to me, they were this esoteric thing for weird people who go hiking and live in a tent. And there was a parent from England at that conference, and he and I sat in the bar saying, did you see those walking poles? He went back to London, bought walking poles for his daughter, who was about 11 or 12, I think, at the time. She'd never, ever walked independently. She always had to have somebody to hold on to. He got her the walking poles, and on the very first day, she walked independently and was off. And last year in Germany, I stayed with a family I know, and the girl with charge, that's her back at the closest to the camera, she was 17, and she could walk, and she had walked independently, but only very, very short distances. She had to have someone to hold on to. And unfortunately, her idea of holding on was to lean on them like this. She's got some developing scoliosis anyway. The mom had heard me talk about the poles, and when I arrived, she said, I bought these walking poles, but you're the expert, you can teach her to use them. And I explained that wouldn't be appropriate because we didn't really know each other, but she said, poof. So we got a bus up in the hills, and we talked to her about the poles and gave them to her. And for almost 2 hours, she walked completely independently. She was just off and going. And at one point, her mum and I laughed because we were both going, and the girl was just plowing up and down the hills. So we're developing more and more understanding of the kinds of ideas and strategies that we can use. So if I can digress, I think the multisensory impairment aspect of charge, I think of it in terms of the child's brain isn't really in touch with the body. We only know what our bodies are doing because we have senses. If you take away our senses, we don't know what our body's doing. We don't know where it is, whether it's moving, whether it's stationary. We don't know where all the bits of our body are. And I think when you look at children with charge and you look at the way they self-stimulate, look at the way they move, and especially look at the way they hold their body, the postures they use, it looks to me as if they're trying to give themselves more information so that their brain has a much clearer idea where their body is and what their body is doing. They're exaggerating the proprioceptive and the tactile information through compressing and stretching and twisting the bodies. And I've written about this, I've got more quotes, far too many quotes here. I just love slides, and I tried to cut them out. At 4:30 this morning, I took 20 slides out, and then I put 5 of them back. And then I got a little late to meet my colleagues. But I'm going to just go through some pictures, and some of these I showed last time. A lot of the postures involve pressure on the head. Where is my head? The vestibular sense is the prime input to tell your brain where your head is and what your head is doing. Vision plays a part. Proprioception plays a part in the neck and the shoulders and the trunk. But the vestibular sense is the key sense. So the children jam things on their heads tight. Hats, buckets, pots, saucepans, you name it. And they don't just put them on, but they wedge them on. And sometimes, once they've done that, not in this case, I suspect, they stand and they walk much more effectively. And you get to the weird but logical situation where a child walks better if they're wearing a hat that's a little bit too small for them. And it sounds nuts, but there's a message there. All the time there's information coming from the children if we're interested in it. Of course, if we're not interested, we ignore it and we keep blundering on, doing maybe the wrong things. Headstands. Children who can't yet walk independently, but evolve these behaviors. They need the information, their brains are growing, and they need sensory inputs. They're not getting the regular inputs that typically developing children of their age get with that, they're 2 years old and they move and they jump and they climb on the couch and they jump and they climb and they jump and they just go on and on with these huge reserves of energy. Children with charge find a different way of getting those inputs. Children who can't walk independently. Postures involving the legs. This is the most common charge posture, I think. One ankle up on the other knee. You see it again and again in all sorts of situations. And it's especially prevalent when children are going to sleep. You imagine trying to relax and go to sleep when you can't feel your body. You don't know quite where your body is. So you don't know if your body's okay. You don't know if it's safe. And this posture is a classic sleep posture. I've got so many photos people have sent me of children fast asleep in this very strange posture for sleeping. And I did hear on Facebook yesterday, a parent wrote about her teenage son, I think it was, or I can't remember, but it was a teenager who W-sits, the infamous W-sit for support, who W-sits in sleep. Not just when awake, but does it in sleep. And then here's a young man many of you know probably from Indiana at the pool with the family who suddenly finds a way to facilitate really relaxing in the sun and going off to sleep. And again, who taught him this? And I said to his mum, did you show him that? She said, no, I took the picture because I suddenly realized what he'd done to stabilize his body so that his brain knew that he was fixed and everything was okay. There's a W-sit picture, which you probably don't need. And then a little bit about vision and the vestibular sense. I'll try and say this very quickly, but there is a reflex, the vestibulo-ocular reflex. This is a reflex by which, if we're looking at something and our head or our body moves, our vestibular sense manages to let us know in advance where our head is going so that we can move our eyes. So if I look at you, I can move my head and my eyes all over the place and I stay looking at you. If you take my vestibular sense away or damp it down, when I move my head, my eyes go with it. And then I have to look for you again. And you find these postures often when children want to use fine vision. Looking at books, looking at pictures, looking at a tablet, playing Super Mario or whatever. You get on your back, you bring one ankle up on the other knee so you confirm to your brain everything's okay, you can relax, you can just concentrate on the book and you're off. Or this kind of posture, even this kind of posture. And here's somebody, a young teen, taking a break, homeschooled, taking a break from a lesson, who gets on her bed with her tablet, immediately gets her head completely upside down and really compressed into the mattress, and then uses vision and thumbs to do her thing. Somebody using the couch. And what the children are saying is, I fix my body to fix my head, to fix my eyes, so I can use my vision effectively, because my vestibular sense is not doing that for me. You can see how amazingly creative this is, because we don't know how the children think of these things, but they do, child after child after child. And we need to honor that, and we need to respect it. And the important thing as well is that these postures, the children are telling us things. They're sending us messages. There is a problem. There is a deficiency here. This is my way of dealing with it, but maybe we should be alerted to think about ways we can help to compensate. A lot of bending and stretching. This is actually being done to look at a television for an extended period of time. But I think sometimes these postures might relate to opening an airway, if there are some airway issues. And also, it can be a really good position to relieve the discomfort of constipation, chronic constipation, which is a widespread issue. So there are other factors going on. And now Dan, after an email message I got from one of his colleagues, from Kareem last week, Dan's starting to think, how often when children do this kind of thing, are they actually getting some vestibular input as stimulation, if you like, through one of their semicircular canals, which is still functioning on some level. Hanging, which again you see fairly commonly. Postures involving the hands, compressing the hands, crossing fingers, which is very unusual in babies and infants. But I've seen children less than a year old crossing the fingers on both hands. Where are my hands? Where are my arms? All the time these brains are saying, where's my body? I've got to get information. I've got to confirm where things are. We see planking. I'll show this picture just because Ingrid's in the room, even though she's not paying attention. And squeezing, a whole range of squeezing behaviors. And a sequence from a mum sent me this. This is a young man. She took a sequence of photos to show him getting into position so that he can then relax with his back pressed hard against the underside of the dining table to reorganize his systems to relax before he gets down. Squeezing, squeezing and compressing, squeezing and compressing. And where is my head? The children use head weaving to exaggerate visual and probably residual vestibular input, head binding, head holding or tapping, head pressing or head standing, and then what's commonly thought of as oral stimulation, which I think of as primarily proprioceptive information. Clenching the jaw, grinding the teeth, and biting and chewing. And how often do you see children who won't walk around unless they bring their shirt up and bite on it, and you see the very wet patch. And now you've got commercially available kerchiefs and this silicone jewelry, which you can wear and chew on to self-regulate. And I need to finish. I said I wouldn't go over, but I'm 2 minutes over. Functions of the postures: to locate the body, especially the head, to confirm postural security, to stabilize the body, to stabilize the head, to stabilize the eyes for visual tasks, to ease the discomfort of chronic constipation, to open up the airway, to self-regulate, pressure being a calming input. And now, thanks to Dan, I have to add possibly to get residual vestibular stimulation, because it's the only way you can get it, probably is by being upside down or by moving down and up and down and up. And what kind of thing helps? Advice from a PT and an OT, activities which improve strength and muscle tone and controlled movement. And I'm thinking of things like Tai Chi, yoga, wrestling, climbing, dancing, adapted PE, horse riding. Deep pressure inputs like jumping, trampolining, massage, and swimming. Binding, especially using spandex. Good physical supports and appropriate postures for efficient functioning. In other words, good postures and good seating. It's really interesting in schools when they follow my advice and they get an adapted chair for a child with charge, how often that child's compliance, that child's attention, that child's academic progress just lifts off, because suddenly their brain isn't thinking about postural security, it's available to actually think about learning. And another quote from the PT at Perkins: spandex is the best friend of children with charge syndrome. And the second slide, lots of variety in postures and lots of movement. And it was great this morning to learn that regular movement, controlled movement, helps us to look after our own selves and to reduce stress. Rest periods for reorganization. And it's important to remember for children with charge, rest might not mean what we think it means. Sometimes they need to get horizontal, or they need to get on their side, or they need to curl into a ball. Other times they need to go nuts and zip round in circles and run up and down and slide and all those kinds of things in order to reorganize. Controlled environments, self-taught strategies, but from them we can learn what to give the children in terms of our input, using strategies that are motivational, and introducing the child to a vocabulary that relates to body parts, physical feelings, emotional states, and desired activities, so that this becomes a central part of your communication and language. And sometimes even something as simple as a slanted desktop can make a huge difference to the child's attention. They're no longer having to do this flexing down, but they can maintain upright posture, which is also good in the long run if they're likely to develop scoliosis. This is probably the most disorganized talk I've given this year. So think about the child's brain needs to communicate with their body effectively. And that might be the first thing we need to support and help, so that they can then communicate with the environment around them, whether it's looking, listening, smelling, touching, or whatever, and then think about communicating out with the outer world. I'm trying to think what I'm saying. Yeah. And although I've talked about problems, this is an old quote from me that just says that really this group of young people have abilities that we need to recognize and we need to honor and we need to respect and we need to tell people about. They can be very creative. They can be fixated on function, and that's a good thing, and it creates problems, but we need to honor that, and we need to let people know that this is a very creative group of people, and not to underrate them on that level. I'm sorry that was a bit rushed. Well, it was very rushed. If you'd like, I can give people a copy of the slideshow. I'll take the photos out, but you can have the slideshow if you contact me, either on Facebook or email me. And my email address was the last slide, but I took it out this morning because it brought the numbers down. So, but catch me if you want my email address, and I'll do that. So, on to dinner. Thank you.